The silence after battle is unlike any other silence. It hangs heavy, laden with secrets whispered only by the dust and smoke lingering in the air. Smoke curled from crumbling buildings and the acrid scent of ash, mixed with the iron sting of blood. President Zelensky walked slowly through the shattered remains of a once thriving village, his boots crunching on broken glass and scorched earth. Around him, the fog of war still clung low to the ground. The only sounds were the distant crackling of small fires and the occasional creak of twisted metal. This was not the first battlefield he had visited, but today felt different, more personal, more final. He moved past the remains of a toppled checkpoint and paused at the edge of a crater where a burnt-out vehicle lay in ruin. Just beyond it, partially hidden under a piece of collapsed wall, lay the body of a fallen soldier, face turned skyward, eyes long closed, hands still clutching something tightly against his chest. Zelensky's breath caught as he approached. The soldier wore no Ukrainian insignia. His uniform bore the muted tones of the Russian army. His face, though bloodied and bruised, was young. Too young. Curiosity pulled Zelensky closer. Kneeling with practiced caution, he gently pried open the soldier's stiff fingers. There, clutched against the man's chest, was a folded, weather-worn letter. The edges were stained, the ink smudged, but something about it felt oddly familiar. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The handwriting, shaky but deliberate, hit him with the force of a blast. It couldn't be. His eyes scanned the first line. "Vladimir, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it." Time slowed. The sounds of war seemed to fade. Zelensky stared at the signature, his heart seizing as he whispered the name aloud. Victor. The world tilted. For a moment he couldn't breathe. This couldn't be real. His brother, missing for over 2 decades, kidnapped as a boy, swallowed by chaos, presumed dead, and now he was lying at Zelensky's feet, a Russian uniform draped over a Ukrainian heart. He looked again at the letter, reading on with shaking hands. "I never stopped thinking about you. They took me young. I didn't have a choice, but I remembered everything. The tree, the cherries, your terrible jokes. I wore their uniform, yes, but I never forgot who I was. I never stopped being your brother." Zelensky's knees threatened to give beneath him. He sat back, the cold earth beneath doing nothing to calm the storm rising inside. "I've seen and done things I'll never forgive myself for. But if you find this, if this somehow reaches you, know that I didn't die a traitor. I died a Ukrainian. I died thinking of home." The tears came suddenly, hot and silent. He pressed the letter to his chest, eyes closed, as memories flooded in, of laughter beneath a cherry tree, of barefoot races through sunlit fields, of a brother's smile frozen in childhood. Behind him, footsteps approached. A soldier, one of his security detail, halted a few feet away. "Sir, are you all right?" Zelensky stood slowly, folding the letter with a care that bordered on reverence. He glanced once more at the face of the fallen soldier, his brother, then pulled a weathered tarp over him with silent respect. "No," he said hoarsely, "but I will be." He turned away from the body and began walking back through the ruins, the letter secure in his pocket. The war was far from over, but something had changed. In the heart of devastation, he had found a piece of himself he thought lost forever, and the echoes of war had spoken. Back at the forward command shelter, President Zelensky sat alone at a steel desk, the letter unfolded before him. A single lamp buzzed overhead, casting flickers of yellow light across the worn paper. The chaos of the day, the firefights, the briefings, the crumbling streets had faded into a dull haze. Only the words remained, words written by a brother long thought dead. He read it again. Every sentence carried the weight of years stolen by war and silence. They changed my name, my language, my uniform, but they could never change my blood. I waited every day for a chance to escape. I failed. So I wrote this, in case I didn't make it. The letter was more than a farewell. It was a confession, a declaration, a cry from the edge of death that longed to be heard by the only person who would understand. Zelensky leaned back, hand pressed over his heart, the letter trembling slightly between his fingers. How many times had he imagined this moment? The fantasy that one day, somehow, he'd know the truth. And now that truth lay bare in ink and pain. A knock broke the silence. Olena, his advisor and oldest confidant, stepped in quietly. Her eyes scanned his face. "You didn't come to the strategy debrief," she said gently. Zelensky held up the letter in response. Olena's breath caught as she stepped forward. "Victor," she whispered. He nodded, eyes wet but unblinking. "I found him today. He's gone, Olena." She reached for a chair sitting across from him. For a long moment they said nothing. "They turned him into a weapon," Zelensky finally said. "And yet, even in their uniform, he fought to hold on to who he was." Olena's voice was quiet but resolute. "He didn't die one of them, Volodymyr. He died trying to find his way back to you." Zelensky looked down at the final paragraph. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to return. But if this letter finds its way home, at least you'll know. I never stopped being your brother. I never stopped loving you." His hand closed over the page. "I don't know what hurts more, losing him now or realizing I already lost him years ago." Olena stood slowly. "Then let this be the moment you stop losing him. Let his truth become part of your fight, for all the others like him, torn away before they had a choice." Zelensky looked up at her, then back down at the letter. The tremor in his hand faded. "We need to identify him properly, give him a burial. No numbers, no anonymity. I want the world to know who he was." She nodded. "I'll see to it personally." As she turned to leave, Zelensky remained still for a moment longer. Then he stood, folded the letter and slid it carefully into the inner pocket of his jacket, close to his chest. Outside, night had fallen. A cold wind swept across the camp. But Zelensky didn't shiver. He stepped into the darkness, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of generator lights. His brother was gone, but his voice remained. And with every step he now took, Zelensky carried that voice forward, into speeches, into battle plans, into every decision that would follow. Because some wars are fought not only on the battlefield, but in the heart. And this one had just become personal. At first light, the base stirred with quiet urgency. Soldiers moved with practiced precision. Equipment was checked, positions reinforced, and orders whispered in corridors still echoing with fatigue. President Zelensky stood in front of a weathered map stretched across the operations table. But his focus wasn't on the red pins or shifting lines of engagement. His mind was still with Victor. He traced a finger slowly along the eastern border where Victor had been found. The location now bore a name and a face, no longer just a red zone on the map, but the last known place his brother had breathed. General Mikhailov entered with a firm step. "Mr. President, overnight surveillance indicates increased Russian movement along the northern edge. They're regrouping, possibly planning a push." Zelensky nodded absently, then turned to meet the general's gaze. "Ensure that Victor's remains are transported with full dignity. He was recovered last night after our patrols secured the area. Assign a team to oversee every detail." The general acknowledged with a brief nod. "It's already in motion, sir. He's been transferred to a secure facility. We've notified your staff." Zelensky exhaled. The previous night felt both like a blur and an eternity. He remembered crouching by his brother's side, staring at the letter in disbelief, and then the moment he gave the quiet order. Bring him with us." There had been no time for ceremony then. No flags or salutes, only silence and the weight of memories too painful to carry alone. He had walked back to the armored vehicle with the letter pressed to his chest, while the soldiers gently lifted Victor's body and laid it across a stretcher with solemn care. That moment stayed with him like a wound that refused to close. Later that day, as final preparations were being made for Victor's burial, Zelensky found himself unable to remain indoors. He slipped away from the base and walked alone through the outskirts of the war-ravaged village. The wind was sharp. Smoke still clung to broken beams and scorched trees. The letter was in his hand again. He stopped beside a half-destroyed farmhouse. The roof collapsed inward, the windows shattered. Everything around him was still, like the world had paused to let him remember. He looked down at the folded page. "They changed my name, my language, my uniform, but they could never change my blood." He had read those lines a dozen times, but now, standing in the cold silence, they felt heavier than ever. Zelensky lowered himself onto a piece of debris, elbows on knees, hands clasped around the letter. He didn't cry. He just stared forward, lost in the swirl of memory and question. Why hadn't he searched harder? Why had the world so easily accepted Victor's disappearance as final? Could things have been different if he had held on longer? He tried to summon Victor's voice in his mind, the way he had laughed, the mischief in his eyes, the soft pat on the back after each silly dare. What had he sounded like as a man? What had he endured? "I hope you hated the uniform they put on you," Zelensky whispered aloud, "but I know you wore it for a reason, to survive, to stay yourself even when they tried to erase you." The wind picked up, scattering ash and leaves across the ruined yard. Zelensky stood slowly, brushing dust from his coat. He tucked the letter back into his jacket. Tomorrow he would speak to the nation, but today he would let the silence say what he couldn't. He turned back toward the base, the wind at his back, the ghost of his brother walking beside him. And somewhere between the wind and the ashes, the past began to speak. The cherry tree was still there in his memory, tall, proud, branches heavy with fruit, swaying gently in the breeze that drifted across the yard of their childhood home. Zelensky could almost hear the soft laughter that rang beneath it, the sound of bare feet pounding against the dirt, the sharp sweetness of cherries between their fingers, the sun kissing their skin. He and Victor had been inseparable, two brothers bound by more than blood, by adventure, by imagination, by loyalty. Vladimir was older, more careful, often the one who hesitated, while Victor charged ahead. Victor, younger by 3 years, was fearless, always the first to climb the tree, the first to dare a leap across the stream, the one who believed the world would never hurt them. "You'll be president one day," Victor had teased once, his mouth stained red from cherries. "And I'll be your bodyguard. I'll never let anyone touch you." Vladimir had rolled his eyes then, but deep down he had always admired his little brother's courage. But the memory turned bitter fast. He remembered the day Victor disappeared. It was summer, the heat thick and unrelenting. They had been playing near the edge of the woods. Their mother's voice called from afar, faint and hurried. And then, a moment when Vladimir looked up and Victor was gone. He had searched, first thinking it was a prank, then calling louder, panicking, running into the trees. No one had seen him, no one had heard anything. The police came, then soldiers, dogs, lights. Hours turned into days, and then nothing. A cold, unyielding silence that swallowed their family whole. Zelensky remembered how his mother sat by the window for months, watching the road as if Victor might walk back one day. His father stopped speaking for a time, and Vladimir, he aged overnight. The guilt had never left him. The last person to see Victor, the one who was supposed to shout sooner, to run faster, to protect. Over the years, people told him to move on, that Victor had likely died, that it was a tragedy, but life must continue. He did continue. School, theater, politics, war, but the laughter beneath the cherry tree never faded. The echo of Victor's voice never stopped. Now, standing on blood-soaked soil with his brother's final words in his coat, Zelensky realized that memory had kept Victor alive all along, that somewhere, deep down, he had never truly let go, and Victor, even after decades of silence, had found a way to speak back. The past was no longer a place he visited. It was now part of the battle he fought, not just for freedom, but for memory, for truth, for the boy who never came back, and for the man who died trying to return. The funeral was held in a secluded clearing just outside the base, beneath a sparse canopy of trees blackened by smoke and scorched by the fires of war. The ground was uneven, the grass patchy, but Zelensky insisted this is where Victor would rest, on Ukrainian soil, not in marble silence, but among the raw, unfinished earth he died defending. There was no fanfare, no camera crews, just a wooden cross, a folded flag, and a handful of soldiers standing in solemn silence. Zelensky stood apart from them, a few steps closer to the casket, hands folded tightly in front of him. He wore his uniform, not the presidential one, but the olive-drab fatigues he had donned when visiting the front. Today, he was not a president. Today, he was just a brother. A soft wind blew through the clearing. Ash swirled in the air like snow. Zelensky knelt by the casket and placed the letter inside. He pressed Victor's dog tags on top of it and closed his eyes. "No more uniforms," he whispered. "Only home now." Behind him, Olena stood quietly with General Mikhailov. They gave the president his distance. Everyone there understood. This moment was not for the nation. It was for him. A chaplain murmured a few words. A trumpet sounded faintly from the edge of the woods, its melody thin and cracking, like a memory being sung through the trees. After the final salute, Zelensky remained kneeling. "I kept going because I had to," he murmured, "but I never stopped hoping. Maybe that's why I never stopped fighting." He stood slowly and looked to the sky, where the smoke had thinned just enough to let a single ray of sunlight pierce through. It struck the top of the cross, illuminating the worn grain of the wood. Hours later, back in his quarters, Zelensky sat at his desk, the cherry tree photograph resting beneath his fingertips, the one he'd carried for years, the last image they had taken together shortly before Victor disappeared. He looked out the window, watching the movement of the camp, the hum of war grinding forward, indifferent to his loss. But in that moment, Zelensky made a decision. He reached for a notepad and began to write, not orders, not a speech, a letter, to Victor, not to explain, but to remember, not to mourn, but to promise, a promise to carry him forward into every step of the war, into every victory, into the kind of peace they once imagined beneath a cherry tree before the world tore it all apart. And perhaps, one day, that memory, like the letter he now held, would make its way home again. Rain fell the next morning, washing the dust from the boots of weary soldiers and turning the pathways between tents to shallow rivers of mud. The sky hung low and gray over the base, but the rhythm of war did not pause. Plans needed revising. Orders had to be issued. Lives depended on action. Yet Zelensky remained in his quarters longer than usual. The letter he had begun the night before rested, unfinished, on the desk. A few lines scrawled in his hand. "You were always braver than me, even when you were little. You never waited for the world to tell you who you were. You just lived. Loud, honest, fearless." He ran a finger over the words, then looked up as Olena entered carrying a tablet. "Morning," she said gently. "There's something you need to see." Zelensky took the device. A report had arrived, intelligence collected from the battlefield, where Victor was found. They had identified the unit Victor had served with, a Russian division known for deep infiltration tactics, some composed of conscripted Ukrainians. But more importantly, a local civilian had come forward, a farmer, elderly. He had seen Victor. He was the one who warned us, the man had said, about the ambush. He spoke Ukrainian, said nothing else, just pointed us towards safety. Zelensky's throat tightened. Victor's final act had been to save lives, even surrounded by enemies, even while wearing their uniform. "I need to meet that man," Zelensky said quietly. Olena nodded. "We've arranged transport. You'll leave within the hour." The drive to the village was quiet, the roads winding through broken landscapes and patches of once flourishing farmland now marked with trenches and debris. When they arrived, the old man was waiting on a bench outside his modest home, wrapped in a heavy coat. Zelensky approached him slowly. "You saw him?" he asked softly. The man nodded. "He didn't give a name, but the eyes, they looked like yours. He helped my grandson get out alive." They sat in silence for a while. "He was tired," the old man added, "but there was pride in him, like he knew he'd found his way back, even if just for a moment." Zelensky closed his eyes, letting the rain fall across his face. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like just weather. It felt like something cleansing. Back at the base, he resumed writing the letter. "They tried to take your name, your language, your past, but they couldn't take your heart. I know that now, and I'll make sure the world knows it too." He folded the page gently, sealing it beside the photo in his personal chest. Not to forget, but to carry. The next morning he addressed his generals. "We continue our mission," he said, voice clear, "but we do it remembering those who were taken from us, not just in body, but in identity. We fight not only to defend borders, but to reclaim the names that history tried to erase." Victor's name, once a whisper in memory, had now become part of the cause, and Zelensky, carrying his brother's courage, would not let it be lost again. Zelensky stood before the cabinet in a dimly lit war room, a projection map glowing behind him. The atmosphere was dense with strategy, reports, numbers, but his tone cut through it all like a blade. "We don't just push them back," he said. "We take back our story." The room fell silent. He continued, voice low but resolute. "The Russians tried to erase who we are. They turned sons into shadows, families into ghosts. Victor was one of thousands. It ends now." Later that evening, he walked alone past rows of temporary shelters. Campfires flickered between the tents. Soldiers sat huddled beneath tarps, their laughter quiet but present, faint echoes of normal life. One of them saluted as he passed, eyes bright with recognition and something deeper, respect. Zelensky nodded and kept moving until he reached the far end of the camp where new recruits were resting. A young soldier stood alone, nervously polishing his rifle. "You remind me of someone," Zelensky said, approaching. The boy looked up, startled. "Sir?" "My brother," Zelensky replied. "He never learned how to stand still either." The recruit blinked, unsure of what to say. Zelensky smiled faintly. "It's good. Movement means heart. Fear means you still value life." He left the boy in silence, walking on. Inside his tent, he sat down at the edge of his bunk and stared at the photo of the cherry tree tucked inside his notebook. The day had been long, but quiet. Too quiet. His thoughts, however, were not. He opened the notebook again and continued writing. "I met a boy today who reminded me of you. Nervous hands, restless eyes, and I realized you live on in more than memory. You live on in the ones still learning to be brave." A knock at the tent flap interrupted him. Olena entered with a soft expression. "General Mikhailov wants you in the comms tent in the morning. There's a broadcast planned, but it can wait." Zelensky nodded. "Let's do it tomorrow. I think I know what I want to say." She paused at the door. "You've changed." "Since Victor, I've remembered," he replied. When she left, Zelensky looked once more at the folded page beside the photo. The war wasn't over, but his silence was. Tomorrow he would speak, not just for Victor, but for all of them, the ones taken, the ones forgotten, the ones still here. The morning came with a clear sky, the first in weeks. The sun broke through the gray, casting golden light across the camp as if the land itself had paused to listen. Inside the communications tent, Zelensky stood before the camera. No suit, no podium, just a worn field jacket, a weathered notebook in his hand, and the eyes of a man who had carried both the weight of a nation and the ghost of a brother. When the red light blinked on, he began. "I never imagined that the war I'd one day lead would be the same war that took my brother." His voice was calm, steady. "For years, Victor was a name I whispered only in silence, a memory I tried to protect by burying it. But I was wrong. Silence doesn't protect memories. It erases them." He held up the notebook. "This is where he lives now, and from this day forward so will the names of every soul this war tried to erase." Across the country, radios crackled to life. Screens lit up in homes and shelters. In trenches, in kitchens, in train stations and hospitals, people paused to listen. Zelensky continued, "We are more than soldiers, more than resistance. We are a story that will not be erased. And today, I ask all of you, write it down, speak it aloud, pass it on, your names, your pain, your truth, because we are not shadows. We are the flame." The broadcast ended, but the silence it left behind was not empty. It was full of memory, of promise, of voices waiting to be heard. That evening, Zelensky returned to Victor's resting place alone. The wind was soft. The flag atop the wooden cross barely moved. He sat beside the grave and opened the notebook. "I gave you my voice," he said quietly. "Now I give you the world." He placed the notebook at the foot of the cross and stood. From the tree line, the sun caught the leaves of a young cherry sapling. No one knew who had planted it, but it had taken root. It was growing, and like all things born from memory and nourished by love, it would never be forgotten.